Hello and welcome to part two of IBM and the Holocaust by Edwin Black. This book came out in 2001 and I've already done an hour video talking about parts one and two, which is linked somewhere on the screen. That'll appear. Now it's disappeared. Hopefully, if you haven't seen that yet, you clicked on it and you're over there watching that. For those of you who are still here listening to me, that's cool. We're going to do part two. We're going to cover the second half of the book. That red marker there that's how far I got last time in my review, and we're going to finish the rest off right now. So please stick around for the next hour or so to hear the conclusion to Edwin Black's IBM and the Holocaust. It's fantastic stuff. It's very eye-opening. You will learn a lot about how the world worked back then. This covers the World War II, obviously, but in looking at the story in here and the things that happened back then, you'll also learn quite a lot about how things still happen and are happening today. One of the first things that I didn't mention in part one that I'm going to take a few seconds to explain now is the research and the sources and the referencing in this book. So one of the first things I started doing now, whenever I get a book and it's hefty like this and it's academic and it's well referenced and sourced and has a lot of evidence, points of data to consider, I get a little tab, a little sticky tab, like this, and I go to the back of the book and I find the page where the references and notes begin. And then I pop a little tab at the top there. To mark where the footnotes and references begin. So if you look in this book, a decent proportion of it is source material. And these are references that back up the points he makes and the assertions. You know, like any good book should really come with a packed back section giving you the evidence and telling you why he's making the argument and telling the story that he's telling. So in the case of Edwin Black, he had a crew of people spread across a bunch of different countries, and they are accessing collections of papers, archives, encyclopedias. They're going into the massive amounts of documents that have been amassed to preserve the story of the Holocaust. Uh, Cheekily, Edwin Black also refers to his own book, the one he wrote before this, which is called The Transfer Agreement. That's on my list. I haven't actually got a copy yet. But I just think it's worth pointing out that each chapter, so let's just have a quick look. Chapter one, basically a 2 or 3 page story. So it's only got 16 references. Chapter two, it kicks off 122 references. Chapter three's got 76. Chapter four has got 121 references. Chapter 5, 117 references. Chapter 6, 127 references. You get the point. I'm not going to keep going. But every chapter is packed full of notes and references to other documents, other artifacts, and other pieces of evidence. Obviously, what this does, it lends the story a lot more credence and it gives the information in the book a lot more weight so that when we're reading it, when we're taking it in and we're adding it to our map of reality, we can be a little more assured that it's factual and actual. And if we have any doubts or have any concerns about the veracity of what's said in here, we can check the references. We can go and look it up and see if he is accurately quoting and attributing the things that he says through the references that he provides. And it's just a sign of integrity to provide the references. It's just a sign of hard work and honesty, and it's just the right thing to do. And then the other thing that we often get at the back of books that I love to check out is bibliography. I haven't counted the number of books in this bibliography, but it is substantial. And what I do is I go through and I underline books that I would like to get hold of and add to my collection at some point. So the one that I underline here is a book by Hannah Arendt, A Report on the Banality of Evil. I've heard this mentioned before, so I underlined it, and that's something I'll try and grab a copy of at some point. Books on the Nazi doctors, the Goebbels diaries, Nuremberg, A Nation on Trial, the Punch Card Data Processing Annual, um, The Destruction of the Dutch Jews, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, A History of Nazi Germany by William Shirer. So I'm just giving you an example. IBM, Colossus in Transition. that just gives you a kind of taste of the level of rigor and research that went into writing this. It's something I should have mentioned in part one, but it slipped my mind. I was just too excited to get into the meat and start telling you the story. But I wanted to put that up front here. This is an incredibly well referenced and researched book. So quickly, just to recap part one, if you haven't seen it or watched it, the link is magically appearing and magically unappearing. To give a bit of just a short recap, we learned in the first half of the book about the origins of IBM as a corporation, and the machines they use were invented by a gentleman called Hollerith. Then the gentleman called Thomas J. Watson comes along and he shimmies up the greasy corporate pole to get to the top and occupy the lofty position of chairman, and runs the corporation like a cult, which the evidence for that is a quote from his son, who says he resents the cult like way his father runs the business. And IBM expands aggressively into Europe, and they take on a German company called De Homag, and they incorporate it. The HOMAG retains its name, so it's kind of on the surface it looks like they're separate companies, but it is actually a subsidiary of IBM, and they are selling the same machines and providing the same products and services to Germany. And at this point, Hitler rises to power suddenly, out of nowhere. Nobody saw it coming. Our man Watson carries on expanding, sees an opportunity, and rides the wave of Nazism and expands alongside Nazism into the countries that Hitler and his cronies invade. That's kind of where we got up to. There's a lot more detail in part one, so please go and recap that. But that is the gist of where we're up to so far in the story. Thomas J. Watson, chairman of IBM, was awarded by Hitler the highest honor that could be awarded to foreigners. He gets this fancy cross. It's got swastikas on it, eagles, and it's a pretty nice piece of bling. And Hitler's so happy with Watson and the way that Watson's company are providing the machinery that allows them to do all the censuses and gather all the data and run all the logistics of their operation, that he gives him this wonderful medal. But then at some point, as the Hitler regime starts to reveal its true colors and the international awareness of what Hitler and his followers are really up to, um, as that awareness dawns and the international community starts to turn sour and starts to hate and dislike and say, oh, maybe what those guys are up to is not so good. Watson realizes that it's going to look bad on him if he carries on doing business there, or if the true extent of IBM's involvement in the Nazi regime is known. And so he makes the decision to return the medal. And as you can imagine, this does not go down well with Tiny Mustache Man. It is considered an insult. It is considered a slap in the face after all the good things they've done together. That's kind of a big move, but Watson's being investigated, IBM's being investigated, and Watson starts and his men start rounding up some of the Germans who work in IBM and saying, no, they might be a bit dodgy and shifty, and getting J. Edgar Hoover to look at them and blame them. So this is where the story picks up right now. The war has begun in earnest. It is on in full swing, but Watson's name is reviled, it says, in Germany and by Hitler at this point because he returned the medal. So they're really unhappy with him, and but of course they're still suckling on the teat of IBM New York because all of Nazi Germany's infrastructure, a large, massive portion of it, is using the IBM machines, and the IBM machines don't work without the punch cards, and the punch cards only come from one place, which is IBM New York. IBM was so successful at building up their monopoly and crushing the competition that there's really nowhere else to get the spare parts, to get the punch cards, and to get the new designs and all the things that the machines need to run. So it's a situation where the Nazi regime is so hooked on this technology that There is no way for it to continue without using this technology and continuing to do business with IBM. So because IBM and Dehomag are still the same company, but Nazi Germany is angry at Watson, there begins this kind of corporate intrigue, corporate maneuvering. I'm not sure what the word is for it exactly, but it's kind of like at the high levels when people start to get a bit backstabby, and they are maneuvering to take over or retake control of Dehomag. Quote, Dehomag was to become completely Nazified. Some of the plans were so sensitive, and the plans here are to do what they did with European Jews. Some of the plans were so sensitive they could not be discussed with outsiders. It was absolutely essential that Dehomag be controlled by the highest Nazi party and government circles. So they start to realize that there's a weak link. At this point, America hasn't joined the war, but Germany are simultaneously doing business with IBM New York while also kind of keeping an eye on the geopolitical situation and what is likely to happen, and realizing that they are very dependent on these machines. So, as Black says here, quote, since the birth of the Third Reich, Germany had automated virtually its entire economy, as well as most government operations and Nazi Party activities, using a single technology, Hollerith. Elaborate data operations were in full swing everywhere in Germany and its conquered lands. The country suddenly discovered its own vulnerable overdependence on IBM machinery. This is the conundrum. The technology is so good that they've built their entire infrastructure on top of it, but IBM New York controls it. And Watson controlled IBM. Quote, Holleriths could not function without IBM's unique paper. Watson controlled the paper. Hollerith could not function without cards. Watson controlled the cards. Hollerith systems could not function without machines or spare parts. Watson controlled the machines and the spare parts. Watson controlled all of it. Returning to manual methods was unthinkable. It's kind of like us with our spy devices. Try not using your phone and going somewhere new and see what happens. It's very hard to imagine rolling back our dependency on the technology, and you can't help but think that that was one of the lessons learned during this time. Was when we introduce this technology and it becomes ubiquitous, the human beings using it become de-skilled and dependent, and they lose their ability to do those things without that technology, and thus become addicted to and enslaved by that piece of technology. So that's what's happened here. And it proves to be quite a struggle. So this whole chapter is called the Dehomag Revolt, because what happens is the Nazi Party try to regain control of Dehomag and kind of elbow Watson out a little bit. Watson's problem at this point is that he's seeing the German progress they're making, and the advances, and he's thinking, I want to ride this wave. How can I best do it? So we find out, quote, the prevailing view among many was that Nazi aggression in Europe was unstoppable, and the economy that would soon be imposed over an entire subjugated continent would flow only to those companies Berlin favored. Owning even a minority of that new dominant Dehomag could be vastly more valuable than the Dehomag IBM owned today. And so Dehomag is very important to Watson. He realizes that these Nazis look pretty serious and they seem pretty intent on taking over. If they do, I want to be able to sell my machines and profit from the regime. Quote, Watson understood that unless he came to an accommodation with Germany, Dehomag was only the beginning. IBM operated profitable Dehomag-dominated subsidiaries in Italy, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Holland, Belgium, Romania, France, Sweden, and indeed almost everywhere in Europe. All of them could be targeted. So he's worrying now. He's thinking this is a massive amount of space, a lot of different countries. It's a lot of machines. It's a lot of tabulation, a lot of cards, a lot of paper, a lot of profits. How can I stay on the Führer's good side in order to be brought along for this ride and to still increase the value for the shareholders, which is, as we all should know, the only legal obligation of any corporation. So, a really interesting part of this is the alien property custodian, which I'd never heard of, but is a kind of agreement between nations of what happens to properties and foreign owned assets and businesses during wartime. Quote, a peculiarity of German law demarcated a strong distinction between the assets of racial inferiors, such as Jews, Poles, Czechs, and other vanquished groups, and the property of what, in the bizarre Nazi mindset, constituted a genuine war adversary, such as Britain and the United States. If the US entered the war, Germany did not believe it would occupy American territory, only defeat the country. During any war, Germany expected its commercial enterprises in America to be safeguarded, managed properly by a trustee, and then returned intact when the conflict ended. In that same spirit, the Third Reich would in turn safeguard, manage diligently, and return American enterprises. Germany's well developed alien custody laws were still in effect. So while Nazi Germany was voraciously plundering and pillaging the width and breadth of Europe, a profoundly different set of rules would apply to IBM and other enemy property seized in any of those occupied countries. Rules for thee and not for me, in a sense, the corporate world is different and distinct from the political world and from the public world. Different rules apply, and this blew my mind to think that these kind of agreements were in place. It reminds me of WWF. The wrestlers, they come out and they bustle and they bellow and they give each other the stink eye and they raise their eyebrows. They whack each other over the head with chairs and they jump on each other and they call each other out and all this stuff. Then when they're off stage or backstage, they sit down and have a beer together and they're best friends. It's that kind of feeling to me. It's a sort of, yeah, there's a war on, but you look after my stuff, I'll take care of your stuff. And when this is all over, we'll get back to business because the business is what's really important. The corporations are above and beyond those pesky little nations that are going around fighting each other. That's the feeling and the sense that I get from this anyway. So I was really amazed to read about this here. We learn later as well that the money that IBM is making in Germany, they struggle to get it out of Germany. So it builds up in these accounts and it gets locked off because they're rebuilding their economy and there's big changes. Hitler comes into power and then he begins mobilizing for the war effort. And so rules prevent money from being extracted. And so all this money builds up and sits in these banks. Then it becomes a question of, well, if war does break out, if America and Germany do officially uh, go to war with each other, then the rules all change and different things could happen. So, quote, but if war with the US broke out, Heidinger and the other managers would be summarily relieved of their management authority, since technically they represented IBM MY. So Heidinger is a Dehomag manager. He is there before IBM take over it, but when they take over it, they let him stay and they give him this little deal with some stocks and shares and stuff. And it's fascinating to me that he is German, but if the war breaks out, because he works for IBM MY, he will then be prevented from managing Dehomag. Quote, in fact, the Nazi receiver would diligently manage all of IBM's European subsidiaries. The money would be waiting when the war was over. These corporate rules and the business rules that they have in place show you how the world really works. The fact that the money will be there when the war's over. It shows you that corporations, they're kind of like safe haven. They're kind of like tax havens. The normal rules that you and I live by don't apply to corporations in the corporate world. And this is where you got to go and be successful if you want to protect your assets and build up generational wealth and live beyond the restrictions of national borders and exist. It's kind of like a parallel society in and of itself. There's a whole discussion in the rest of this about how the Dehomag and IBM assets are going to be protected and managed during wartime and the need to to get into a position of plausible deniability so that IBM can't be investigated or seized or connected to any war crimes and this sort of thing. At some point, Watson sends over a man called Chauncey. Chauncey is Watson's top negotiator, and he gets sent over there to ensure that the profits are safe and secure, that Dehomag will continue to place orders from IBM New York, and that basically the arrangement will continue unimpeded and uninterrupted so that the profits can continue to build up and flow. However, as I mentioned before, as the war progresses, it looks like America might get involved. The Nazis start worrying about IBM New York being so aware of their practices and what they're getting up to with these holorith machines, which if I haven't mentioned in this video, I certainly did in the last. These holorith tabulating machines are used to carry out censuses and identify who is who. And as you know, it was very important to the Nazis to know about your Jewishness, if you have any, and how much of it you had. In the previous video, I quoted that they were looking to find amounts of Jewishness down to whether or not you're a quarter Jewish. It's actually an eighth. They were checking, okay, maybe you're Jewish or half Jewish, maybe you're a quarter Jewish, or even if you're an eighth Jewish, they wanted to know that. That's what these machines were used to calculate, because they would collect data from people and build out family trees and then trace your ancestry and heritage. And if you had Jew maybe 2 generations ago in your family tree, then they come after you and count you as Jewish. So that's what the Nazis are using this technology for. And IBM New York don't care. They're not interested. They have to make that clear. So this man, Chauncey, the negotiator, gets sent over there. And then we find out, quote, the main Nazi objection was made clear. IBM New York, now proven disloyal, would discover the secret planned uses of the holorith machines. Chauncey and his fellow Berlin-based attorneys did everything they could to constantly repeat the assurance that they would not ask questions or learn details. He told Heidinger he was willing to go to any officials to show that IBM had not obtained any information of the confidential matters being done by DeHomag. Again, IBM New York made a fine distinction between what its headquarters in New York would discover and the day-to-day knowledge its managers, engineers, and servicemen on site would be required to know to do their job. I suppose this is similar to whether or not the manufacturers of guns are responsible for gun crimes and murders, something like this. Quote, clearly, Chauncey contended, the Nazis now understood that IBM's technology was vital to their war aims and too entrenched to be discarded. Replacing holoriths, he argued, would be a long, difficult task in view of the military's large use of DeHomag machines. Indeed, despite all the animosity, Chauncey wrote, the business has, however, gone forward, due to the need of the authorities. Nazi Germany needed punch cards. Only IBM could provide them. So that is what's going on. The Nazi regime is hopelessly hooked on these machines and this technology. They have no way to roll back their dependence on them, and so they have to keep going. Quote, millions of punch cards were routinely shipped from IBM in America directly to Nazi-controlled sources in Poland, France, Bulgaria, and Belgium, or routed circuitously through Sweden or colonies in Africa. When IBM's American presses did not fill orders, subsidiaries themselves would ship cards across frontiers from one IBM location to another. So it's a buzzing, whirring machine of supply and demand, all done smoothly and efficiently with the kind of mechanical precision which is really only came into force after the Industrial Revolution, I would say. So to wrap up part two, there's a great paragraph here. Quote, during all the genocide years, 1942 to 1945, the DeHomag that Watson fought to protect did remain intact. Ultimately, it was governed by a special Reich Advisory Committee representing the highest echelons of the Nazi hierarchy. The DeHomag Advisory Committee replaced the traditional corporate board of directors. As with any board, the committee's duty was to advise senior management, approve and veto special projects, and mandate priorities. The day-to-day decisions were left to managers to execute. When needed, it coordinated with IBM Geneva or its representatives in other subsidiaries. 4 men sat on the advisory board. One was a trustee. Second was Passau, chief of the Machinelles Berichtswesen. Third was Heidinger. Fourth was Adolf Hitler's personal representative. Hitler's representative on DeHomag's advisory committee was Dr. Edmund Wiesenmeyer. I'm going to take a quick break from the book to go over to Wikipedia, the source of sources, and have a little look at Edmund Wiesenmayer. And this is a pretty interesting experiment that you can do at home as you're watching along to this. Pull up a tab, get onto Wikipedia, type in Edmund Wiesenmayer, that's Wiesenmayer, then hit Control F to find, and then type in IBM. Nothing. What is he known for? His complicity in the mass deportations of approximately 300,000 Hungarian Jews. He was tried and convicted at the ministry's trial after World War II, sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, released after serving 2 years. But Wiesenmeyer was involved in some nasty stuff and was using the holograph machines to organize the deportation of Jewish people and packing them onto trains and sending them off. The fact that he was Hitler's trusted advisor on IBM's board in Dehomag, the fact that he was Hitler's representative on Dehomag's advisory committee, uh, thought might be worth mentioning on the Wikipedia page. That's the end of part two. And we're on part three, which is the final part of the book now, chapter 10. This is the struggle to stay in the Axis. So here we get a lot of headlines and quotes from the New York Times as Hitler's efforts to extinguish the Jewish people really get into full swing. IBM executives start to panic because they're kind of wondering which way the war is going to go and really trying to calculate what's their best bet on being involved with the winning side. Although, as we find out later, that's kind of a moot point because they end up helping both sides and supplying their machines and technologies to both sides. So it says here, quote, IBM executives began to wonder if they might sell some shares to the Hitler government itself, going into a direct partnership with the Reich. Very good example of corporate responsibility. And we see that Wiesenmeyer, he's pushing to get IBM to relinquish its majority in Dehomag. And we find out that, quote, by now, Chauncey, Watson's lead negotiator, he had learned when speaking over the phone to refer to Wiesenmeyer obliquely as that official or an official. A lot of this book is giving us the account of the negotiations and the wheelings and dealings of these execs and how they struggle to maintain control and how they battle and come to blows with each other, with Thomas Watson obviously rising to the top in most instances. But it seems to me to be a very cutthroat world. They are not averse to cutting people out, to pressuring them and browbeating them to gain control, to make sure the profits are still flowing, and to make sure they've got the right people in the right places to ensure that the profits continue to flow. So IBM is still doing what it can to make sure that its business interests in Europe continue to be profitable. And this, they turn out to end up having the full support of the American government. Quote, during IBM's day-to-day struggle to stay in the Axis during wartime, the firm relied on the cooperation of the State Department to act as postman. Every message relayed through an American embassy or legation was not just blindly passed on. Multiple copies were made for senior staff in Washington. The department's desire to secretly advance the commercial causes of IBM persevered in spite of the nation's officially stated opposition to the Hitler menace. So here is talking about the European Affairs Division. So it's a case of what we are seen to be doing, what the official line is, which is, well, this Hitler guy is really bad and we can't help him or support him or do business with him. We gotta really put a spanner in the works of his efforts. But then behind the scenes, the deals keep going and the money keeps exchanging hands, and the communications between the two sides are facilitated and protected. So as time goes by, it becomes apparent and obvious and impossible to ignore the Dehomag's management has been taken over by the Nazis. Quote, there was no pretense that Dehomag's management was still a group of independent minded employees or executives. They were openly pawns of the Nazi Party. So while IBM came to believe they could not be dislodged from the Axis, they did fear the diminishment of profit that any attempted competition, howsoever tenuous or distant, might pose. The man who would not even tolerate competition from used cash registers, that's Watson, would now only intensify his effort to block competition from diluting IBM profits. Ironically, the diligence of IBM auditors to certify and report that profit never paused during the entire Dehomag revolt. Even as Watson expended maximum resources to protect his monopoly, the accountants were busy double checking every penny. But at no point did the paperwork stop being created and the records stop being kept. The number one priority of Watson and IBM throughout this whole thing was to make sure that the business is protected and that they are operating within the corporate structure and the legal framework of wherever they happen to be operating. This is part of what gets described later on is the genius and the amazing feat they managed to accomplish, which is wherever they went to do business, they would do it perfectly in line, crossing every T and dotting every I according to the rules and regs of that particular country. We learn then about General Ruling 11, quote, an emergency regulation forbidding any financial transactions with Nazi Germany without a special Treasury Department license involving written justifications. IBM would now be required to seek a complicated bureaucratic approval for each financial instruction it ordered for its overseas subsidiaries under Nazi control. General Ruling 11 would not affect subsidiaries in neutral countries such as Sweden or Switzerland. So there are challenges and blocks and hurdles put in place to prevent IBM from doing business and profiting off the back of the Nazi war machine, but they figure out ways to get around it. Of course, they do. This is just what people with massive amounts of money and influence do. They find loopholes, and these guys are no different. General Ruling 11 is applied, but they don't. It doesn't really get in the way of anything. They just break it. Chauncey, the lead negotiator, he goes to Washington D.C. to seek out this written justification from the Treasury Department, and you're supposed to apply for this from the Fed, and he just goes directly to the Treasury Department itself. And because they have to now get this Treasury license, people in IBM New York are not authorizing payments, not authorizing orders, and these kind of things, and basically gums up the works. And then we learn that, quote, Watson must have been furious. For decades, IBM had tiptoed through the serpentine regulations of 70 countries, whether at war, in peace, or anything in between. From fascist states to revolutionary regimes, the company had always managed to avoid legal infractions of any kind. Now it appeared that General Ruling 11 had been violated. General Ruling 11 was essentially a precursor to trading with the enemy regulations. It was more than important. Moreover, Chauncey's name was on the proxy that effected the transaction. Everyone began explaining themselves in carefully worded memos and letters. So, this is the corporate world. They are having to be extremely cautious about what they say. A lot of communication will be done with inferences, with people reading between the lines, with people paying attention to what is not said and left out as much as what is said. And it is tiring to me to read some of this stuff sometimes. I don't get the nuance of the corporate world. I haven't spent much time in it. Certainly haven't spent any time hobnobbing with the people at the top who know how all this works and how all this stuff is talked about and communicated. What happens is that they go ahead with the deal or the order. I can't remember exactly why they need the treasury license, but they decide to act as though they get it. And somebody tells someone else that, yeah, we've got the license, don't worry about it, process the payment and the order. And then they do manage to get it more than a month later. And I think this is also indicative of largely how the corporate world works. A lot of backdating, a lot of handshakes and nods and winks and agreements, and then hurriedly forging documents after the fact. So my experience of the corporate world has been that there exists many processes that you are supposed to follow, and that there are many methods and frameworks that you're supposed to work within and apply. But rarely do any of these things actually reflect reality and the way things really work and the way people behave and the way human beings interact and deal with each other. So found it very frustrating at times to butt my head against the hubris of corporate people who think that life and the complexity and the richness and the beauty can be summed up in a catchy acronym. Chapter 11, France and Holland. This chapter deals mainly with Germany moving into France and Holland and how on the way they are trying to count the Jews who live there and trying to carry out censuses, but without the holorith machines, censuses are pretty difficult to do. Then, so they start commandeering them and incorporating them into the war effort and the Nazi war machine so that they can carry out their crimes against the Jews. Luckily, IBM had already been to France and Holland and seeded them ahead of time with their holorith machines. But we find out that, quote, in all, 319 holoriths were commandeered, spirited out of France, and dispersed to waiting Reich customers throughout Germany. So they're taking them from France and sending them back to Germany. Germany cannot get enough of IBM's holorith machine. It's becoming clearer and clearer what Germany are about, what Hitler and his Nazi party are about, and what they're trying to do. Watson is just determined to carry on making money and doing business with them no matter what. He's really not too concerned uh, with their actions in their stated goals and the things that they are, the atrocities that they're obviously intended on committing. So in Holland, there's a really interesting story and episode here, which is how the Dutch Jewish complied. So it says, quote, although nearly all of Holland angrily condemned the Nazi registration, the Jews did as instructed. With few exceptions, every Dutch Jewish family dutifully picked up its questionnaires, filled them out completely, and filed with the nearest registration office. That's the census. The uncanny compliance was based on traditional Dutch respect for laws and regulations, as well as the stated penalty for not registering, 5 years in prison and the confiscation of property. Jews also understood that resistance was futile because their names had already long been innocently registered as Jewish in numerous statistical and registration bureaus throughout the Netherlands, and especially in the new card indices created by Lenz's personal identification program. Even though some Jews rioted in early February 1941, the entire community nonetheless filled out the forms as required. More than 157,000 questionnaires were ultimately returned in the first month, more than the entire Jewish community, because many sympathetic Dutchmen actually volunteered to register alongside their Jewish countrymen. Lenz's punching cadres began converting the Jews to Hollerith records as quickly as possible. But none of it was fast enough for the Nazis. So at this point, they are still gathering data, finding out where the Jews are and how many of them there are, and that's kind of why they're marshaling all this IBM technology. So during this time, the censuses are so common and happening so often that we read that quote, during the months and war years to come, exactly which censuses were taken, by whom, and by what method, will constitute a maze of mysteries befuddling all in France and Germany. Registrations and census efforts would be announced and scheduled, and then delayed and rescheduled. They would take place over a period of months, but often the deadlines would be extended because the results were so incomplete. Some counting efforts were undertaken just in Vichy, some just in occupied France, some in both. Many campaigns counted Jews. Many counted the entire French population. Most were executed by a myriad of ad hoc census styles from the inept to the diligent. Incomplete, inaccurate, and inconsistent data ruled the entire enterprise. Heads of household were often counted instead of entire families. Children were often not included. Addresses were not infrequently omitted. Confused officials were on occasion forced to admit they simply had no idea where many of the Jews of France were. So again, we're learning about the power of data collection and what people who hold vast amounts of data can do with it. What could be the question I would ask is what could be the benevolent motivations for wanting to collect massive amounts of data on people? And we're always told that it's for our convenience. You know, it's to make your life easier and your life better and your life more convenient. But I would just ask the question, are things getting more convenient? Is it more convenient nowadays to make a phone call to a business where you have to sit through hours of pre-recorded robotic voice menu options and rarely, if ever, get to speak to an actual human being? Is it convenient to have to provide credit card details just to use a website or to have to log in and provide an email address just to activate a new gadget or gizmo that you've bought for your home? I'm not sure. I think we might have passed peak convenience, and we're now heading into something else that is a lot more insidious and a lot more restrictive. Only it's so gradual and it's so ubiquitous that it's kind of hard to see it. That would be my hot take on that anyway. But it is very interesting to read about the origins of this whole movement here. We then get the story of Rene Carmille, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that name incorrectly. Rene Carmille, a mysterious French military technocrat, rescued his tabulators. So the Germans are stealing holorith machines. These are the valuable things that they want to get hold of. And this guy, he is like saying, "Screw you, Germany. You ain't having my holoriths." And he moves them. Quote, under cover of night, he moved the precious devices from his military finance office to a hiding place in a garage. In doing so, the French military's punch card capability was preserved. So he is credited with preserving the punch card capability of the French military. But it goes on. He, once established, Carmyle carefully began strengthening his small arsenal of tabulators. Not only did he work with holoriths, but he also had access to a bull and even a powers machine. So bull and powers machines are rare competitors to the holorith machines. In 1941, Carmyle signed a 36 million francs contract with Bull for new machines, even though the chance of delivery from their new plant in Lyon was in great doubt. He also signed a multi-million franc contract with CEC calling for a series of powerful machines to be delivered on a strict schedule. Millions of francs in fines and penalties were to be paid by CEE if they could not maintain the delivery regimen. When Carmyle began the demographic service, he was not allied with the General Commission on Jewish Questions, the anti-Semitic Vichy agency coordinating Jewish registrations, but he was certainly hoping to attract the agency's attention. In March 1941, he made a point of informing GCJQ, Director Valat, that his statistics for Jewish students were incorrect. Carmyle had been working for months on a national personal identification number, a number that would not only be sequential, but descriptive. The 13-digit PIN number would be a manual barcode of sorts, describing an individual's complete personal profile as well as professional skills in great detail. For example, one number would be assigned for metal workers with a second modifying number for brass, and then a third modifying number for curtain rods. Tabulators could then be set to whisk through millions of cards until it located French metal workers, specializing in brass with experience in curtain rods. Those metal workers could also be pinpointed in any district. The system mimicked a concurrent write codification system that assigned a descriptive barcode-like number to every product and component in Germany. Carmyle's number would ultimately evolve into France's social security number. So that's where France's social security number came from. But again, capturing this obsessive, technocratic desire to track everything and label it and put it in a database and give it a code, give it a barcode and a unique identifying number because it's all stock, it's all resources. And then inevitably, this way of thinking becomes transferred to the domain of humanity and we become human resources. No longer are we sovereign beings with a soul and dreams and passions, and we are now resources to be used up, to be deployed in a, in an efficient way in order to maximize the amount of returns. And then once those resources are spent, who cares? We'll get some more. But then we find out Carmyle, and I really need to look about to pronounce this person's name, Carmyle. It turns out that Carmyle was a secret agent for the French resistance. Quote, Carmyle had deceived the Nazis. In fact, he had been working with French counterintelligence since 1911. During the worst days of Vichy, Carmyle was always considered one of the highest placed operatives of the French resistance, a member of the so-called Marco Polo network of saboteurs and spies. Carmyle's operation had generated some 20,000 fake identity passes, and he had been laboring for months on a database of 800,000 former soldiers in France who could be instantly mobilized into well-planned units to fight for liberation. Under his plan, 300,000 men would be ready to go. He had their names, addresses, their military specialties, and all their occupational skills. He knew which ones were metal workers specializing in curtain rods and which were combat ready troops. That's a really good part of the story. I enjoyed reading that because up until that point, we hear about this man Carmyle and all the things he's doing and the role he plays in gathering all this data in these machines. And then there's a twist at the end. It turns out that he's been dragging his feet, he's been muddying the water because he gets ordered to do all this stuff by the Nazis, and he is doing the job, but he's doing it badly and he's feeding them disinformation the whole time. Unfortunately, he meets a sad end. Quote, in early 1944, SS security officers ordered Carmyle arrested. He was apprehended in Lyon at noon on February 3rd, 1944. He was taken to the Hotel Terminus where his interrogator was the infamous Butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie. Barbie was despised as a master of torture who had sadistically questioned many members of the resistance. Carmyle went for 2 days straight under Barbie's hand. He never cracked. We then get introduced to Harold J. Carter. He is noticing that there's something shady going on with IBM. He's starting to connect the dots. He's a normal guy, but he is figuring out that this steady stream of treasury license requests from IBM is a red flag. Um, this is at a time when Thomas J. Watson's veneration internationally and his esteem in America overcame any incongruities and embarrassing curiosities of his little understood multinational technocracy. So Harold J. Carter, he figures out something is up and he starts paying a lot of attention. It says here, quote, IBM wielded a crucial continuing impact on Nazi Germany's ability to plan and wage war. And that's what Harold Carter is figuring out. And then this document gets written called Control in Business Machines. It's an 18-page preliminary report. It's in draft. And is this written by Harold Carter? Yes. And this contains a very important quote. So this is from Control in Business Machines. It begins, this is a story of a peculiar type of cartel. And that's exactly what IBM is at this point. It's a cartel. Quote, this world war is a conflict of warlike nationalistic states, each having certain interests. Yet we frequently find these interests clashing diametrically with the opposing interests of international corporate structures more huge and powerful than nations. I mentioned this in part one that there are corporations out there that are bigger, than turning over a larger profit and making more money than many countries And what are we to do with these things? They exist beyond the realm of influence. They are supranational, I think is the correct word. These international corporations, and this is from the document Controlling Business Machines, these international corporations have grown so large that very often their interests and the national interests within which they are supposedly contained do not coincide. That is exactly true. That is exactly what is still going on today. And people should be aware of it and look into it because these monopolies, they grow with the hunger that Thomas J. Watson had, which is the hunger of absolute world domination, squeezing the competition and ruining the competition as well, trying to get rid of them totally, which leaves only one option, your Amazon or your Apple or your Coca-Cola. I don't want to live in a world that only has Amazon, Apple, and Coca-Cola. Do you? So then we learned that throughout 1942, a number of American companies were grandly exposed for extensive dealings with Nazi Germany. A so-called proclaimed list of blacklisted companies had grown from 1,800 in the summer of 1941 to 5,000 European and Latin American companies by mid-January 1942. So I've said previously that it surprises me that IBM were allowed to do this and that the plug wasn't pulled on the Nazi effort. It surprises me even more that there were 5,000 companies getting blacklisted for dealing with Nazi Germany, and IBM didn't end up being one of them. So, to shed some light on why this happened, certainly scores of American firms used international connections to trade with the enemy. None of them needed more than their own profit motive to pursue such deals. I've been saying it so many times in this review, but it really is keep the money flowing at any means necessary as long as the money's coming in and the shareholders are getting their dividends. That is a corporation fulfilling its sole legal duty. So then we get to the part of World War II that America get involved. Quote, although Watson had been America's chief peace exponent during the Hitler years before Pearl Harbor, he had prepared for the day when the United States would enter the conflict. As early as August 1940, the War Department began speaking to Watson about converting IBM's manufacturing muscle to war use, but not for Holleriths. The War Department wanted IBM to make machine guns. Obviously, Watson is happy about this opportunity to make more money and goes straight ahead. Two small canning buildings were purchased for $200,000. Within 60 days of the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, Watson unveiled a fully equipped 140,000 square foot manufacturing facility staffed by 250 employees. The first product was a 20 millimeter anti-aircraft cannon. 60 days. What we know about Pearl Harbor, according to the book The Double Cross System by J.C. Masterman, is that there was foreknowledge and it was allowed to happen. So I put the question here, did Watson have some foreknowledge? Was he told about it? He was asked, according to this, to make machine guns, but 60 days is a really quick turnaround to build a machine gun factory. So so this is the part where Watson begins helping out the Allies. America's pulled into the war. We learn, quote, IBM and its technology were in fact involved in the Allies' most top secret operations. The Enigma code crackers at Bletchley Park in England used Hollerith machines supplied by IBM's British licensee, the British Tabulating Machine Company. It was an irony of the war that IBM equipment was used to encode and decode for both sides of the conflict. There it is. The money has to come from somewhere, and the weapons and the machinery have to come from somewhere. Not only are the Hollerith machines and IBM uh, involved in building weapons and decoding and encoding messages for the military on both sides of the conflict, but the IBM machines were also used to track people. Holleriths organized millions for the draft. So they're used as well also to call people up to send them off to fight other people. And then, of course, America in 1940 has a census. This census asked a number of detailed personal questions. A national campaign of gentle persuasion was launched to convince people to provide the answers. In one radio address, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt promoted the 1940 census as the greatest assemblage of facts ever collected by any people about the things that affect their welfare. She acknowledged, much doubt has been raised as to the propriety of some of the questions, but she added, they were designed to yield facts which will provide illuminating data on problems which have become particularly pressing. Wonderful example here of the gentle persuasion to hand over your data and give it up and just, log your fingerprint onto your phone so you can get access. Oh, just give us a scan of your face so that we can unlock your mobile phone for you. Then you don't have to press the button. Uh, it's 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 no longer do we need to even be persuaded gently. We don't even need some famous politician to come on the TV or some member of the royal family. Now we just hand all that data over. Just take it. Uh, just anything you want to know is uh, gathered and willingly handed up to the most powerful corporations in the world by every single one of us. And I'm as guilty of it as you probably are or might be. I shouldn't judge. There might be some people out there who are very clever and canny about their data, but it's certainly something that should be on all of our radar. Um, this data, there is a unquenchable thirst for data, and the more data that is collected, the more that they want to collect. And where does it lead? Well, this book attempts to give you an idea. We pick up the story again with Harold J. Carter, who is going against a corporation that was intensely vital to almost every aspect of the US war effort and the Nazi war effort. Don't forget. Good quote here sums this up. IBM was in some ways bigger than the war. Both sides could not afford to proceed without the company's all important technology. Hitler needed IBM. So did the Allies. And then another one here. IBM had come full circle. The firm had now become a strategic partner in the war against the Third Reich, even as it continuously supplied the enemy, as before, through its overseas subsidiaries. Carter's investigation was finished. The crusade to save the machines was on. The next part of the book is covering the Holocaust itself, and a good paragraph here that introduces this quote, for the Allies, IBM assistance came at a crucial point, but for the Jews of Europe it was too late. Hitler's Holleriths had been deployed against them for almost a decade and were continuing without abatement. Millions of Jews would now suffer the consequences of being identified and processed by IBM technology. So in the next chapter is called Extermination. And in this chapter, we learn about how the IBM machines are used to record deaths and manage slaves. One thing that stood out to me and I found very interesting here is the majority of the deaths recorded by the Hollerith machines were of natural causes. But each camp has a Hollerith department which required Hollerith experts trained by an IBM subsidiary to run them. So the IBM corporation is still training people, or their subsidiaries are training people to use these machines, and these machines are being used to run slave camps. Here's the part about the cause of death. Quote, cause of death was recorded for column 24. So column 24 will be the column on the punch card. Generally, the murdered inmate itemized on the top line was coded C3, the Hollerith designation for natural causes. For convenience, ditto marks signifying natural causes would then be dashed next to every inmate number, but these death citations were faked for amusement. More thousand guards might force an inmate to jump off the quarry cliff at a spot called the parachute jump. Exhausted laborers might be crowded into the tiled gas chamber below the sick bay, where carbon monoxide billows would suffocate their lives. Undesirables might be terminated in Operation K actions, a bullet administered at close range, or special cases might be hoisted by their arms tied behind their backs until they died from the socket wrenching excruciation. All these murders were almost always dittoed C3, natural causes. So then we learn about the Central Institute, and that is not me mispronouncing it. It is spelled Zentral, Central, Institut, Institute. That is Central Institute. This was a secret punch card facility, a special statistical bureau located on a quiet residential street in Berlin. So the Central Institute was able to render the big picture because it processed the most individualized details. So the big picture is something that that is the picture of the logistics of the entire camp system is called the big picture. And the big picture is communicated through daily strength reports. The Central Institute's elaborate Hollerith banks were expensive Dehomag systems, but the SS could more than justify the cost because slave labor was sold by the SS Economics Administration and managed as a profit center. So they have slaves, they are managing the slaves for profit, and then with these profits, they're buying Dehomag systems from IBM. And IBM's accepting this money. So again, here we got uh, kind of a repeat of the point we just talked about, but it says again, most death reports were coded C3, death by natural causes, even when people were openly murdered. Just something that stood out to me. So they carry on identifying where the Jews are and how many of them there are, and tabulating this information. And they're doing this for the occupied territories and putting numbers to each place, and then planning on how they're going to dispose of these massive numbers of people. And we find out here, quote, a two-tiered genocide was emphasized, extermination by labor and expedient mass murder. In the course of the final solution, the Jews are to be allocated for appropriate labor in the East, the protocol recorded. Able-bodied Jews, separated according to sex, will be taken in large work columns to these areas for work on roads, in the course of which action, doubtless, a large portion will be eliminated by natural causes. The possible final remnant will, since it will undoubtedly consist of the most resistant portion, have to be treated accordingly, because it is the product of natural selection and would, if released, act as the seed of a new Jewish revival. So they are planning ahead, and they're even thinking about what to do with the people who don't die of natural causes. In the course of the practical execution of the final solution, Europe will be combed through from west to east. The evacuated Jews will first be sent group by group to so-called transit ghettos, from which they will be transported to the east. Persons of mixed blood of the first degree married to persons of German blood would be treated, essentially, as Germans. So then we learn that we're at the part of the Holocaust where people are getting loaded up onto trains, and if we find out that the Central Institute, which is collecting all this data on deaths, um, weren't told, weren't sent any death records because, quote, it was enough to inform Central Institute that the people had boarded a train. Hence, the machines only tabulated the evacuations. No more was necessary. From these trains, there was no escape, no need for tracking, no further utility, and no further cost would be expended. At this point, the Jews were no longer worth a bullet, nor the price of a single punch card. So massive amounts of deaths recorded, as natural causes, and lots of evacuations recorded as well by the Hollerith punch card data gathering systems. I then learned about the Jewish councils, or Judenrat. I need to ask my German friend how to pronounce that properly. So Germany had forced Jews to help organize their own annihilation by establishing Jewish councils. I'd never heard of these before, but there's a book on these that I'm going to try and get hold of to read more about them. But these get set up in the ghettos, and there's a really tragic section here which describes how the head of these Jewish councils, quite often more than not, committed suicide in protest of what they were being asked to do, which was facilitate the um, extermination of their fellow Jews. So we got this quote here at the end of this chapter. Quote, "The Jewish Council's resistance never effectively delayed any German action in the ghettos. With scores of Jews dying of starvation or disease each week, a collection of suicides and executions simply became part of the hellscape. But their sacrifice made one thing clear. Even though they never comprehended the technologic intricacies of the process underway, and although most had never seen a punch card, they did sense that all the registrations and endless lists added up to a single odious destiny. They fought back with their only remaining weapon, the power to control their own extinction." The last two chapters are the spoils of genocide 1 and 2. And this is where the war wraps up and we find out how IBM, well, we know where IBM went from that point because they become a household brand that probably 99% of people who know of it do not associate with the Holocaust. I remember where I was when I was told about this story. I was sitting in a car. I was on my way back from London. I'd been to a protest there, and my friend was like, "Yeah, IBM, it was massively involved in the Holocaust and provided all the machine." And I'm like, "What?" That's why I grabbed this book, as I mentioned in the first video. Um, so, The Spoils of Genocide 1 is telling us about how IBM New York played the war to its own advantage. Quote, "In fact, a pattern emerged throughout war-ravaged Europe. Before America entered the war, IBM New York and its subsidiaries worked directly with Germany or Italy or its occupying forces. As part of the strategic alliance, it also worked with German sympathizers and allies in countries such as Romania, Yugoslavia, and Hungary. Watson would even order new subsidiaries established in conquered territories in cadence with Nazi invasions. Even after America declared war, IBM offices worldwide would openly transact with these clients or with other subsidiaries until the moment General Ruling 11 was triggered for that particular territory. As the war in Europe expanded, General Ruling 11 jurisdiction was extended as well until all of Nazi dominated Europe was proscribed. They are really unscrupulous and just looking at the whole war as opportunity. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Then, however, things change a little bit, as I mentioned, once the United States joins the war. But the General Ruling 11 is a minor inconvenience to IBM's overall profiteering and money making machines. So then we get to 1942, December 17th, and this is when the Allies finally declared there would be war crime trials and punishment. The Allies warned that all who cooperated with Hitler's genocide would be held responsible before the bar of international justice. Now, I double underlined this quote and I wrote in the margin Operation Paperclip. I have a video reviewing a book by Tom Bauer called The Paperclip Conspiracy, which proves that that sentence that I just read out is baloney, I think is the technical term. The Allies were not so interested in making sure all who cooperated with Hitler's genocide would be held responsible. In fact, the Allies were more interested in recruiting and giving lofty jobs and contracts to many who cooperated with Hitler's genocide. And if that sounds pretty out there and crazy and you are incredulous, then I urge you to go and check out my review of Tom Bauer's book, Operation Paperclip. The link is where links appear, and it's gone. But I had to double underline that and say, no, that's not true. A bit of clarity then on IBM. Quote, IBM's business was never about Nazism. It was never about anti Semitism. It was always about the money. Before even one Jew was encased in a hard coded Hollerith identity, it was only the money that mattered. And the money did accrue. Millions in blocked bank accounts scattered across Europe were waiting for IBM, as well as its newly acquired real estate, numerous Hitler-era factories and presses, and thousands of Hollerith machines. Much of the money and plant expansion was funded by a fundamentally bankrupt Third Reich, which financed its rapacious operations by slave labor, massive plunder, and cost-effective genocide. Where did Hitler's Germany get the money to pay for all the services, cards, and leases? Nazi gold and currency was fungible, whether carted away from banks in Prague or priced from the teeth of Jewish carcasses at Treblinka. The Reich could afford the best, and it purchased the best with the assets it stole. This is a good time for me to tell you about my next book review. The idea that I came up with here is to review books in order to put them on your radar, to make you aware of stories and information and artifacts and evidence that's out there that you might not have heard of before, in order to have a better map of reality, a better understanding of the past and how we got here, in order to make better decisions moving forward for you, your friends, your family, your loved ones, and humanity as a whole. The idea is when I finish a review to pick three books from my library that connect to that topic, and then open that up to whoever's out there listening to this to decide which book I'm going to review next. I already made a video with the next three options on it, and the book that came out is this one. This is Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony C. Sutton. Um, I thought this would be a good time to mention that that's the book I'm reading next because of the quote I just read, which was about where did Hitler's Germany get the money to pay for all the services, cards, and leases? Hmm, that's a great question because the money's got to come from somewhere and the machines have got to come from somewhere. This book, which I haven't read yet and I'm really looking forward to reading, is very well respected. And as you can probably guess from the title, is putting forward the astonishing true story of the American financiers who bankrolled the Nazis. Now, if that does not make you incredulous and wanting to hear more, I don't know what will. But actually, maybe I do know what will. This book has pie charts. It's got information and data. That is what it's all about, ladies and gentlemen. Facts, information. I've gone really bright and white suddenly. It's like I'm being abducted by UFOs. Not now. I've got a book review to finish. Boom. So, two points there that I've had to address that I think Edwin Black is weak on. He doesn't seem to be aware of Operation Paperclip, and he doesn't seem to be aware of Anthony C. Sutton's research. And thought I would signpost those for you there. So, the war is coming to an end, and IBM is kind of figuring out how it's going to handle all these different subsidiaries all over the place. And we learn about how IBM systems are crucial in the speedy and timely running of railway systems on both sides of the war. But so we're still in the spoils of genocide one. A really key thing to bear in mind is the role that the neutral countries played, because Switzerland is one of the enablers of IBM. Switzerland acts as this, it's neutral. They're not getting nothing to do with us. We're not getting involved in the war. You know, you Germans and Jews, you guys figure it out between you. It's nothing to do with us. We're cool. We're standing over here. And it ends up Switzerland being the commercial nexus of World War II. Quote, its famous financial secrecy laws, neutrality, and willingness to trade with enemies made Switzerland the Reich's preferred repository for pilfered assets and a switchboard for Nazi-era commercial intrigue. In 1935, when talk of war in Europe became pervasive, Watson moved the company's European headquarters from Paris to Geneva. So Watson is realizes that he can maintain contact with the Germans and the Nazi regime and carry on doing business if he does it via a neutral zone such as Switzerland. But they are pretty canny and crafty, IBM. They cover their tracks so that, quote, the record was well papered to protect IBM's legal position. From 1942 to 45, IBM New York would wire uncharacteristically verbose and belabored instructions to its managers in neutral Europe to repossess machines, stop trading with subsidiaries in enemy countries, and terminate contracts with blacklisted firms. Each such instruction stood out as a veritable disquisition of deniability laced with highly patriotic rationales for obeying the law against trading with the enemy. But when blacklists arrived, Watson's most trusted managers in Sweden and Switzerland would get strangely busy, as one IBM internal probe termed it. Or managers would ignore New York's lengthy tractates to stop direct trading with Axis nations, sometimes delaying more than a year. In many instances, elaborate document trails in Europe were fabricated to demonstrate compliance when the opposite was true. Nonetheless, the true record would be permanently obscured. During the war years, IBM's own internal reviews conceded that correspondence about its European business, primarily through its Geneva office, was often faked. Dates were falsified, revised contract provisions were proffered to hide the true facts, misleading logs and chronologies were kept. So this is what I said before. In the corporate world, things are agreed, things happen, things move forward, and then the documents are produced after the fact and put in place. And oh, they were there all along. We've always had the evidence and the permit and the contract. It's right there. Look, it's always been there. Um, and this highlights another aspect of the corporate world that frustrates me, which is that what is written down, it takes priority over actual reality and what happens in reality. So there's this strange emphasis on the data and what's on the systems and what's recorded in the databases and what's stored on the hard drives and nowadays in the cloud on the SharePoint and all this stuff. And that stuff, those ones and zeros, what basically amounts to ones and zeros, take precedent over the actual human beings and the actions and activities of those human beings and the outputs and the results of those actions and activities of those human beings who are in the corporation. So there's a kind of disconnect because all the corporation is a bunch of human beings doing stuff. Nowadays, it tends to be that they're sitting at their desks shuffling around pixels all day long, and the order of those pixels has carries more weight and gravitas than what actually happens in reality. And that's what this is saying here, even back then, is that, well, as long as we write down in paper that you cannot trade with these people anymore because we have a duty to our country and we're at war, so we're telling you to stop doing. They write it all down in a lengthy tractate in belabored instructions and verbose messages. They write it all down and send it, and that's the proof that that's what they intended and that's what they did. But the managers get it and ignore it and carry on doing business as usual. So this disconnect between the data and the information and what's written down, the ones and zeros, versus the actual reality of human beings and what they're doing. It frustrates me no end. I'm sure you've picked up on my frustration at the end of that rant. But it's pretty amazing that IBM's own internal review comes to the conclusion that there's a lot of fakery and forgery and falsification going on at this time. So to get back to the neutral zone and the headquarters in Geneva, Quote, foot dragging, false logs, and contrived chronologies were commonplace at IBM Geneva. And then Watson, of course, he's the mastermind behind all this. Quote, Watson himself set the stage for IBM Europe's wartime conduct. In October 1941, he circulated instructions to all subsidiaries. In view of world conditions, we cannot participate in the affairs of our companies in various countries as we did in normal times. Therefore, you are advised that you will have to make your own decisions and not call on us for any advice or assistance until further notice. That instruction never asked IBM executives to stop trading with the Hitler regime or place a halt on sales to the camps, the war machine, or any German occupying authority. Watson only asked his companies to stop informing the New York office about their activities. This is the corporate world. It was back then, and it still is today. Another good quote here about IBM's business philosophy. Perhaps IBM's business philosophy was best expressed by an executive of Belge Watson in an August 1939 letter to senior officers of IBM New York. The letter detailed the company's growing involvement in Japan's aircraft industry. The IBM Brussels executive declared, it is none of our business to judge the reasons why an American corporation should or would help a foreign government, and consequently Mr. Decker and myself have left these considerations entirely out of our line of thought. We are, as IBM men, interested in the technical side of the application of our machines. I imagine that is what the gun manufacturers would say and the weapons manufacturers. Eh, we design it, we're interested in the technical aspect. Does it do what it's supposed to do? Yes, then it's out of our hands. And in a way, I agree. So then, last chapter, we are nearly there. The last chapter is the spoils of genocide 2. So this is where we find out the end of Heidinger's story. If you remember, he was the manager of Dehomag, which was the German subsidiary of IBM. And then we learn about IBM soldiers. They're pretty. That is worth mentioning. So the IBM soldiers were American soldiers who worked for IBM, and when they were out in the theater of war, they would go out of their way to protect IBM assets and to steer destruction and bombs and carnage and damage away from factories and buildings which contained IBM Hollerith machines. And they called themselves affectionately IBM soldiers. Quote, the framework for IBM's continuing bond with its employees at war began long before America joined the conflict. At Christmas 1940, Watson informed all employees soon to be drafted into the military that they would be granted 3 months' pay up to £4,000 while absent. The money would be paid to inductees in 12 monthly installments, a comforting stipend for the family back home while the men were in uniform. Watson announced, we shall miss you during the time you are away, but we feel that your year's training will be beneficial to you physically, mentally, and morally. Yes, there is nothing like developing one's sense of morals um, than going to war and shooting a bunch of people. Watson says, quote, we want you to know that your friends in the company are back of you in every way, and if at any time we can be of help to you, please let us know. I don't know how old Watson was at this time, but I do notice that he's not offering to go up there and carry the bags of ammo and the first aid kits and the hand grenades. So once the war is over, the question of reparations comes up, and IBM was not included in those conversations. Their own kind of opinion, they deployed Chauncey again, the good old chief negotiator, and they take a position. Quote, IBM's view held that even if their machinery and corporate acumen had helped organize and optimize the Third Reich's aggression, they should be held exempt, ipso facto, by virtue of its American ownership. The company contended that its Nazi payments were protected revenues. So they are saying, hey, we just we were just doing business. Hey, come on, it's just business. Come on. Um, that's my oversimplified, boiled down explanation of the corporate tease which surrounds these kind of topics. But Black saying here, indeed, the world understood that corporate collusion was the keystone to Hitler's terror. How well did the world understand that if most of the world have no idea that IBM were so involved? That's blows my mind. The Nuremberg trials then get underway. Quote, German magnates from the steel, finance, automotive, and chemical industries were also arrested and sent to the Nuremberg dock. And then we get a list of names, we get a list of companies. Um, so, as I mentioned before, as I learned in Operation, the book Paperclip Conspiracy, this whole Nuremberg reparations, holding everyone to justice thing, it was a half job. It was a half a job. They didn't see it through and they didn't get it done properly and completely. When the Nuremberg trials are underway, they are calling people to testify. They're getting witnesses and they're holding people to account. And we learn about that here, quote, indeed, the trial process was slowed by the necessity of translating all documents, exhibits, and testimony into several languages of the War Crime Tribunal, French, Russian, German, and English. Justice Jackson turned to a newly invented process called simultaneous translation. One company reviewed all the evidence and translated it not only for real-time usage at the trial proceedings, but for posterity. That company was, you guessed it, International Business Machines. Just unbelievable. So, International Business Machines at IBM, they did the machinery which enabled Hitler and the Nazis to round up the Jews and send them off in trains and execute them. They provided the machinery which enabled the Allies to draft the soldiers and get them together and produce weapons and send them to war. They produced the machinery which allowed Bletchley Park to encode and decode messages on both sides of the war effort. And they provided the machinery which translated all the evidence into multiple languages for the proceedings of the Nuremberg trials. Not only did they do all that, but they did not get punished. They carried on growing and expanding and dominating their area of business. They're still going today and they are still making super fast computers for collecting and gathering data and processing that data. And I'm probably not the only one, but I'm worried about what those machines are going to be used for in the future because history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Thank you very much for sticking with me for this part two of my HEYS Reviews episode on IBM and the Holocaust by Edwin Black. We made it to the end. I hope you learned some stuff. This is, again, a book worth having. The writer, whose name is here, he's online. He's done lectures and he's a very well-spoken guy. I think he does very detailed work. I have another one of his books called The War Against the Weak, which is a history of eugenics. Hint, hint, it didn't start in Nazi Germany, it started somewhere else. That's a book I'll have to get around to reviewing for you at some point. But I just want to say I am humbled and grateful for anyone who stuck with me and watched this video. I'm going to keep making these reviews. I'm going to keep putting together video and content for you to enjoy, hopefully, and to learn from, definitely. My intention here is to help people who aren't as fortunate and lucky as I am to have access to this amazing treasure trove of information. The books that I've put into my library are it's one of the things that I'm most proud of in life is this library that I've put together. And it just occurred to me that not everyone has access to these kind of books. Plenty of places in the world where books are hard to come by, or Amazon doesn't deliver, or secondhand bookshops are not full of just absolute pieces of treasure like this. And so I thought the least I could do is try and put it together for other people to benefit from and learn and share with whoever's out there that might be interested in these things. So that is me rambling an outro. There should be some music fading in about now. I'm going to wrap this up, play a bit of guitar music to you to calm you down, to see you out. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful, productive, happy, healthy, satisfying, joy filled, love and laughter driven experience until we meet again.